Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. For months, almost a year actually, the refrain has sounded, Russia hacked the election. Russia colluded with Donald Trump. It was unprecedented behavior, treasonous, really. Heard that night after night on this show. We've been told we need a massive, semi-permanent investigation to expose all these crimes. We might even need to nullify a presidential election. Okay, so let's say that Russia did hack the election. What would that look like? A few $1,000s spent on lame, ineffective Facebook ads? Probably not. Instead, it might look a lot like what was actually going on for years at the Podesta Group, the Democratic lobbying firm co-founded by Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman, John Podesta. According to a source we spoke to who worked there at the Podesta Group for years, the company received huge sums of money from a pro-Russia shell group in order to bolster Russia's interests in Washington, all without declaring itself the agent of a foreign power, which it demonstrably was. Election hacking might also look like the infamous and fraudulent Trump dossier, which was compiled in 2016 and then released this past January by BuzzFeed as a laughably stupid news story. Much of the information in that dossier came from Russian sources with ties to the Kremlin. Who paid for this? Well, at one point, funding came from the Democratic National Committee, Hillary Clinton's campaign, possibly even the FBI. So let's say you were looking for a smoking gun in this Russia story, and many are looking for that smoking gun. We now have evidence that Democrats literally paid money for Russian intelligence, as well as proof that the top Democratic lobbying firm in Washington was getting rich by advancing Russian interests. Collusion? If that's not collusion, what is collusion? We put a lot of calls out today, and very few Democratic lawmakers were interested in talking about this at all. The rare exception was Brad Sherman of California, the honorable exception, and he joins us tonight. Congressman, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you. I'm here to talk about the tax bill.
The tax bill. Well, unfortunately,
I mean, this is a job-killing, deficit-exploding tax bill, which is the real story, the real vote in Congress.
Let me just cut you off.
I know you can't defend it.
Before you go, we don't have a tax bill. We have no idea what the details are.
We have the Trump-proposed 12-page document.
We have literally nothing.
We have a 12-page document, which is pretty long.
And then it'll get to the Senate, and it will become something completely different. So I would love to debate that because I think it's really interesting, and we may not even disagree on parts of it. But I want to ask you about the story that we have spent the last year talking about.
You can't defend the Trump tax proposal.
This is clever, and I will have you on any day to talk about an actual tax bill.
No, you won't. I've been trying to get on your show to talk about economics again and again and again, and you only have me on to talk about nonsense.
Spare me.
And then,
really, the nonsense that the Democratic Party has hijacked the workings of Washington for the last year over this Trump story, or the Russia story, and for you to say
you've got no defense for Trump's impeachment. The man has committed high crimes and misdemeanors, and your only defense is, well, Hillary did too. You can't impeach a private citizen and say that's a reason not to impeach a president who's guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors. I am.
I think you've jumped off the rails a little bit. Let me ask you some factual questions and see how you do with those. You can put the bumper stickers away. What do you make of the fact that the Podesta Group, with whom I know you're personally familiar, was taking money from Russian interests to advance those interests in Washington?
I'd like to take a look at it, but it's irrelevant to whether we should impeach Donald Trump. He is guilty of obstruction of justice.
But
you're trying
so you're not even going to engage on that question? What do you make of the fact that the Democratic National Committee, from whom I assume you take money, gave money to the people who wrote the Trump dossier, whose information came from Kremlin-connected sources? Does that bother you? That they used Russian intelligence in the course of this?
That dossier was funded first and foremost by Trump's Republican opponents.
Correct.
There is nothing in that dossier.
Whose names we don't know.
Correct. There is nothing in that dossier that appears to be stolen information. What we have here...
Well, first of all, you don't know that. And
I don't know whether there are Martians who are landing on the planet.
Of that, but we know for a fact, because it's been conceded, that information, some of it, came from sources around Vladimir Putin.
This is a document that had no effect until
that's your
after
excuse.
the election.
So I'm just a simple question.
No.
Look,
I don't need an excuse because whether we impeach the character of a private citizen is an irrelevancy. Whether we impeach a president who is guilty of obstruction of justice
Wait, but I'm talking, hold on, slow down.
Okay, this had no effect on the election.
The presidential election, well, you don't know if it had an effect on the election or not.
How can you affect an election by a document that's released 3 months after the election?
Because the information, the document was run in BuzzFeed. The information went to the Hillary Clinton campaign.
And information that was of absolutely no use. Scurrilous rumors about the sex life of Donald Trump that were not released.
I'm a little bit surprised that you have spent the last year telling us that Trump has colluded in some way with the Russian government and that he has committed, in effect, treason, which is basically what you've been arguing. I don't
accuse him of treason. I accuse him of obstruction of justice. Take a look at Section 1512 of the Felony Code.
But you're not bothered by the fact...
He's committed obstruction of justice 3 times. It's not the crime. It's the cover-up.
Right.
We learned that with Watergate, and we learned that now. And Richard Nixon could not have stayed in office.
Richard Nixon?
Richard Nixon could not have stayed...
I'm asking you a really simple question about the news of today, which is...
No, the news of today is this tax bill that's going to cost us millions of jobs.
You don't know what's
That's what happened.
The tax bill.
We do have the Trump tax proposal that you can't defend, but is the official and most significant economic document released by the Trump administration in 10 months.
I think I'm searching back in my mental files to recall an example of greater disingenuousness than the one I'm witnessing now. You went bananas over the Donald Trump Jr. meeting. Oh, he met with a Russian. This is, the end of times.
I never said that. You've got me confused with another good-looking bald guy.
No, I don't. You are the guy who did that. I'll get the tape.
It's the obstruction of justice, and I've identified
telling us why it was so poisonous to American democracy for Trump or his campaign to have any contact with the Russians.
No, my
now we have evidence that the Democratic campaign was doing it.
You've got me confused with some other good-looking bald guy.
I follow this for a living. But let me ask you
I follow this for a living, too. And I know that this is the most significant economic document released by the Trump administration. You can't defend it, and you want to talk about nonsense.
I'm sorry, let me ask you.
You want to talk about why Hillary Clinton is bad instead of why Donald Trump should be impeached.
You filed articles of impeachment
for obstruction of justice.
The day after that story about Trump's son broke. That's the day that you... Oh, that was just an accident. Okay, right. This is... Look,
I circulated those articles of impeachment a month before the date you identified.
Okay, so let me ask you a really... It was July 12th. Let me ask you a simple question. Trump's connections to Russia, you have consistently argued, are a big deal. It's not a fake story.
No, I have consistently argued that his obstruction of justice last February, May, and July are violations of Section 1512 of our Felony Code. Obstruction of justice applies whether there was collusion or not.
It has nothing to do. So your entire party has spent the last year telling us this is the most important thing that has ever happened. We now have evidence that the charges you are making against Trump apply to your own party and your own candidate, and you're ignoring it, and you're throwing this fit on my set telling me, oh, it's not a big deal. Why do you want to talk about the tax bill?
May and July. Obstruction of justice 3 times, violation of Section 1512.
You're not even, you know what? I honestly, it's hard for me to believe, given everything you've said in the last year, that you're putting on this performance now. Why don't you just say, look, what Hillary did, her campaign paying for intelligence from the Russians, that was bad, but she's not president. Let's move on. You won't even say that.
I don't know what Hillary did, except she
Actually, we do know. What do you mean we don't know? We know exactly what she did. They admitted it this week.
They admitted that they paid for opposition research. Every campaign
well, of course they all do.
For opposition research.
That comes from the Russians? This dossier came from the Russians.
No, this dossier came from a research firm and a British individual.
Really? And who is the British individual? Do you know?
I believe his name is Mr. Steele.
Yeah, and why was he hired? Because he was the head of the Russia desk at MI6. He was a Russia expert, and the information was about Trump's ties to Russia. They got this information from the Russians, and they paid, in effect, Russian sources for it.
They paid a man to prepare a memo.
Quick, does it bother you? Does that bother you at all?
Not particularly.
Does it bother you? Has the Podesta Group ever lobbied you for anything?
I believe they have. I believe they've also. I believe you're also a friend of Tony.
I'm not a friend of him, and he's never lobbied me. I'm not a sitting.
Well, you're not a member of Congress, yes.
And I'm not a friend of Tony Podesta's. But does it bother you that Tony Podesta took money with Paul Manafort from the Russians to carry their water in Washington?
Does it bother you that Paul Manafort was chair of Trump's campaign?
Yes, it does.
Well.
Does it bother you that the Podesta firm was working on behalf of the Russians?
I would like to. If it was true, it would bother me.
It is true. I mean,
You're asserting it. A lot of things are asserted on this.
No, I'm not asserting it.
Okay.
It is factually
You're
true
saying that he failed to file a foreign agent's report.
You know, that's I believe that to be true. What I know is true is that they took money from Russian interests to represent those interests here in Washington.
Well,
and I think by your standards, that's wrong.
When you say Russian interests, if you mean private companies, that's different.
No, I mean I mean the Russian government. I mean the Russian government.
If he did it, why don't you want to talk about impeaching a president? And your answer is, hey, there's this lobbyist in town who isn't any good.
Because the predicate for this impeachment is exactly the same behavior.
You haven't read my articles of
have.
impeachment are only a page and a half, and you haven't bothered to read them.
Actually, I have read them.
Then you know.
And I think they're even more fatuous now than I did before. Now that I know that there's no principle that undergirds them, that you're willing to excuse anything the Democrats do.
Justice is a crime. Yeah. It is a felony punishable by 20 years, up to 20 years.
Come back when you got a tax bill and you want to chat about it.
The tax bill's been released, and you can't defend it.
Yeah, right. Byron York, chief political correspondent at the Washington Examiner. He joins us tonight. Byron, we're going to use inside voices now. So you just heard Congressman Sherman, who's sitting still right next to me, say, in effect, it's not a big deal that the Hillary campaign paid for this dossier or that the Podesta group was lobbying on behalf of the Russians.
Yeah. Are you going to talk about me?
We're going to talk about right here. Wasn't a big deal.
Yes, it was a big deal. But even before we had this revelation from the Washington Post that the DNC and the Hillary campaign had paid for the dossier, even before we knew that, I think you saw a shift in tone among Democrats away from collusion.
And started yelling about the tax bill?
No, they were talking more. They were talking about Russia's active measures in the campaign, and Russia did have a campaign to influence our presidential election. There's no doubt about that. And indeed, you see with the articles of impeachment are about obstruction of justice, about the president's firing of James Comey. In other words, you get to a point where collusion doesn't matter, so you don't have to prove that. It's just that the president obstructed justice.
We've repainted the slogans on the barn. We never said that.
Yeah.
We're just moving on to that.
But I think what has happened now is, after an attempt to paint Russian involvement as a one-way street, where the Russians were trying to hurt Hillary and help Trump, and Trump was somehow dealing with them, I think we've seen it's a much more complicated picture, because it is a fact that this foreign agent, the former British spy Christopher Steele, did get information from Russians who were connected to the Kremlin. You just look at the dossier. The dossier has source A and source B and source C, and they're identified as, you know, a senior Russian foreign ministry official, or a former senior Russian intelligence official, or a senior Russian financial official. So it's not a secret that they're dealing with people who are in the Russian government connected to the Kremlin. So what has changed now is we're now seeing these democratic efforts to get dirt on Trump from Russia. And that does sound suspiciously like what Donald Trump Jr. thought he was going to get in that June 2016 meeting at Trump Tower, when some Russians had approached him and claimed to have had some sort of dirt on Hillary Clinton. They didn't, and that's not what the meeting was about. But it's very similar here.
Interesting. We still have the Congress. Would you like to interject?
My articles of impeachment have always been about obstruction of justice. It's not the crime, it's the cover-up. We've got 3 different instances of violation of Section 1512. They do not, whether Trump colluded or he didn't collude. He tried to stop the investigation of
Are you a little embarrassed? Tell me you're a little bit embarrassed by these revelations.
I'm not embarrassed at all. What I'm embarrassed is that we're not here talking about impeaching a president and stopping a bad
thing. You think are important.
Yes. The things that are important to the American people is who's their president and what's their tax bill, not whether the last candidate for president had a good campaign or didn't have a campaign.
We've had you on many times.
It's as silly as trying to say that Richard Nixon should be in office because you have dirt on George McConnell.
So let me.
That's insane.
Thank you very much. You rose to the occasion. Let me just ask you quickly, given the performance you just saw from Congressman Sherman, if Democrats were to take control of the House of Representatives in the midterm election a little more than a year from now, how long would it take, do you think, to impeach the president?
You know, I think that's a bit of a fuzzy question, because go back to 2006. George W. Bush's poll numbers are in the tank, and it looks like Democrats are going to win the House, which they do. But early on in the election, before the election, John Conyers, who stood to become the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, was talking about impeaching President Bush. There was a lot of talk from the left wing of the Democratic Party about impeaching Bush, so much so that prior to the election, Nancy Pelosi, who stood to become Speaker, came out and said impeachment is off the table, because they didn't want the election to be about impeachment. And if you have a lot of talk about these articles of impeachment coming up to next year,
that's a good point.
Look what could happen.
We'll talk about the commercial break. We're out of time. Would you like to read the tease, Congressman?
I'll read the tease. The post-Weinstein backlash against sexual harassment is consuming a top political analyst at MSNBC. But what are the risk of accountability turning into witch hunt? More right-wing take on this will come up right after the commercial.
Thank you. In the wake of the Harvey Weinstein scandal, more and more people are being accused of sexual harassment. The latest target is MSNBC political analyst and Game Change author Mark Halperin. At least 7 accusations have been made against him, though only 2 women have gone public with their allegations. HBO has canceled plans to adapt his latest book on the 2016 election into a miniseries. What to make of all of this? Tammy Bruce is a radio host, and she joins us tonight. Tammy, I know Mark Halperin. We're not friends. I don't really know what to think. He appears to have admitted some of this obliquely. And so I hesitate to weigh in, except one part of it sticks out, and that's that in this case, and as in a lot of others, a lot of the accusations are coming anonymously. It doesn't mean they're not true, but one of the keys to American justice, I think, has always been you get to face your accuser. You get to know what you're being accused of, and you get to know who's charging it. And that seems to not be in force anymore.
Well, I think that Mr. Halperin perhaps does know who's making the accusations.
Yeah, I'm sure.
The issue is not that we deserve to know. And let me just say,
That's a good point.
I agree that it's a little concerning when you've got accusations made that affect someone's future, and we've dealt with this on campus, et cetera, with accusations versus targets. But in the case of someone like Halperin, I would argue, anyone in that position, where you're not dealing with, let's say, famous actresses, these are perhaps still women who are in vulnerable positions, where there could still be certainly some retaliation, that the ability to do this anonymously, especially when there's multiple accusations, where now they're saying it was, just like Weinstein, an open secret, that it may in fact still be safer for these particular women to do it in this fashion. And yet, when we're looking at, as why we know the names when it comes to Harvey Weinstein, it's perhaps easier because you've got women now who are somewhat established, who have names, who Americans feel that they know. But I think there's an even higher risk for the unknown, non-famous women, also frankly like women in Hollywood who are on crews, who are behind the camera, who are doing technical things. It's still different for them. So I think I think it's fair that at this point there's an anonymous dynamic, as long as internally over at ABC in this case that these things are handled fairly for these women.
I wonder from a news perspective what our responsibility is as journalists. So there's no other crime or alleged crime where we would print the name of the accused but not of the accuser. We would never say Tammy Bruce has been accused of embezzling money by an anonymous person. The anonymous person would have to be named. I wonder why news organizations sort of only print half the story.
Well, in this, look, this is, though, you've got to consider the context. This is now seems like a wave. Right.
This is definitely a wave.
This is a push. I mean, this is an environment where each step has encouraged other women to come forward, where women are thinking, well, maybe this is okay now. This is a safe time to do it. There's now some recognition that apparently there's a report that ABC, the network, knew of these allegations at the time, that these women were not silent. So you have backgrounds where other action was taken. I think, though,
that's a different thing right there. Yeah. If ABC Network knew this,
yeah, and now these are, again, all of this will, is going to work out in a certain sense with information. But as we report these things, we know also that these are accusations, they're allegations. Right. And Mr. Halpin's going to has made certain decisions, as has HBO and his publisher as well, as you've noted. So, but we do have a responsibility to make sure that we're talking about the larger issue, the things that are affected, the kinds of women affected, the nature of our responsibility, also as people in that environment. With ABC, women who may have known, and if certainly in Hollywood, that conversation still happens about the vulnerability of women. But then my point as a feminist is the older women, financially secure, who are not at risk. Where do those women come in here? And is our feminism responsible? Do we have a duty to speak up when we do know? And I think that is something that's key for all of us at this point.
Well, yeah. I mean, of course, if people who say they represent women who keep this information secret.
Well, or even act against them, like the Lisa Bloom case, when you've got a lawyer who is using feminism as almost like a slogan, and then ends up using that simply for what might be just personal enrichment, or at least the opposite of what she.
Of course, well, she's Al Sharpton. Yeah, of course, she's selling moral cover.
Well, it's feminism has become a business, and this is something that we need to also take back, I think, a little bit.
Tammy Bruce, a clear thinker. Thank you.
Thanks, Tucker.
Yesterday, we told you about Jesus Campos' mysterious visit to Mexico right after the Las Vegas shooting. The head of his union is here to answer our questions about that, which is good. Next. That indicated that Mandalay Bay security guard Jesus Campos made a previously unknown visit to Mexico. It's 700 miles round trip from Vegas, and he did it within just days of Stephen Paddock's mass shooting, even though Campos was a major witness, maybe the major witness to the massacre, and apparently was shot in the leg during it. We raised a bunch of questions about the shooting, like whether Campos was actually a licensed security guard, whether he'd ever interacted with Stephen Paddock in the past. In a shooting with so many mysteries, these seem like reasonable questions, but so far police have stonewalled us, hung up on us, actually, when we asked them. Fortunately, the head of Campos' union is more forthcoming. David Hickey is the president of the Security, Police, and Fire Professionals of America, and he joins us tonight. Mr. Hickey, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
So, our sense is that Jesus Campos' story is of great interest to his employer, MGM, and they're doing whatever they can to shape it. Is that your sense?
I think Mr. Campos' story is of great interest to everyone.
Yes, we agree.
Based on the tragedy, yeah.
So let me ask you a couple of questions, just factual ones, because we don't know them. What was his job at the hotel?
Jesus is a security officer, or was a security officer at Mandalay Resorts.
Is he licensed by the state? How does that work?
No. Security officers that work directly for a company, in-house security, they do not have to be licensed. They don't have to have guard cards, security cards. If they work for a contract agency, then yes, they do.
Oh, okay. We tried to get the answer from the Clark County Sheriff yesterday, and he wouldn't reveal that. You were aware that Mr. Campos went to Mexico shortly after the shooting, correct?
Yes, I was.
And what was the purpose of that trip? Do you know?
He told me directly that was a pre-planned trip.
Yeah.
He had planned to go visit family, and after the shooting, he was still capable of doing that. So he went ahead and made that trip on the weekend. I spoke with the local officers. I was actually going to fly in on that weekend, and because Mr. Campos was going to be visiting family and returning on Monday, then I flew in on that Monday to meet with Mr. Campos.
Huh. No one would begrudge the man a vacation, of course, but because he was a key witness in this investigation that was still ongoing and chaotic at that point, did investigators have qualms about him leaving?
Not to my knowledge. There were no qualms about him leaving, because his plans had been made prior, and he intended to return on Monday, which he did.
By car, the whole up and back?
Up and back, yes.
Can you describe the nature of his injuries?
Mr. Campos was wounded in the left thigh. Two fragments of a shell hit him in the left thigh, and when I met him for the first time on that Monday, he was recuperating. He was in good spirits and looking to tell his story and move on with his life.
Had those fragments been removed when he took the trip to Mexico?
You know, I was told one of them had been removed and one of them had not, and that they were going to deal with that issue at a later date.
Had Mr. Campos ever seen Stephen Paddock before the shooting?
Not to my knowledge.
Does he still work for MGM?
He still works for MGM, yes.
Did they set up the Ellen interview, his employer?
I don't know who set up the Ellen interview. We had 5 interviews set up
yes.
prior to that. I know that when I was in town, Ellen's interviewer, the person that schedules the interviews, called Mr. Campos on his cell phone. He handed me the phone. I took the phone, responded to her that she could call to arrange an interview if she wanted, and then we didn't hear from her. And of course, after that, Mr. Campos was taken to a clinic on Thursday.
But why did he skip the interviews?
I can't speak for Mr. Campos on that. I've had no contact with him since that time, and you know, I think it's Mr. Campos's story, and I think he has a right to tell it on his own. But you know, as far as we were concerned, we were prepared to do the interviews. We were hours away, 5 hours away from actually doing the first interview.
And then he disappeared with that explanation. Do you know where he went?
We received a text saying that we are taking him to the quick care.
And who's we? Who was taking him?
There was, when we left the room, we were having a meeting with 3 upper-level MGM management people, and when we left the room that we were in, left the living room, it was Mr. Campos, one other security officer, a fellow member of the union, and then there was a corporate security officer.
Yeah, of course there was. MGM's in charge, clearly. Thank you very much for all of that. Really interesting.
All right, thank you.
Thanks. John F. Kennedy was shot more than 50 years ago, 54 years ago actually, yet the FBI and CIA are still fighting the release of some of the documents related to that case. Not that they're hiding anything. We'll talk to 2 experts on the Kennedy assassination who will explain why this is happening. Stay tuned. Delayed in history, 54 years later, the JFK files are finally being made public, or were supposed to be. More than 3,000 documents pertaining to the Kennedy assassination investigation were supposed to be released today. The president touted that on Twitter. Many of them, though, are now being withheld yet again as the CIA and other agencies make redactions to them. They overruled the President of the United States, apparently, in case you're wondering who's really in charge. Why are they doing this? What could they possibly be hiding? Dr. Michael Bodden was chairman of the House Select Committee on Assassinations Forensic Pathology Panel that investigated JFK's death in the 70s. Gerald Posner is the author of the celebrated book, Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK. They both join us tonight. Gerald, first to you. I know that you've written the premier book arguing for the single shooter and that the conspiracies are nuts, and you really did a lot of work on it. You can see why, and I read your book and believed it, but you can see why if the CIA 54 years later is basically telling the president, no, we're not releasing it, we need to redact more, they're hiding something. What could they possibly be hiding?
No, Tucker, you're absolutely right. It's infuriating because the longer they hold on to these files, the longer they fight for them, they give people the feeling that they have to be hiding something big. And as a matter of fact, I've started to look at some of those that have been released now, 54 years later, and they're going to spawn all types of new conspiracy theories because it's very hard to put them in context. You're grabbing one file from 1963 from the Central FBI office out to a field office reporting that somebody said, oh, on Kennedy's funeral, there's going to be an assassination plot against Earl Warren. Here's the person's name. I guarantee you people are going to be going down rabbit holes chasing all of these. It's going to create a new industry. It's unfortunate. It's what the intelligence agencies do. They overclassify documents. They keep them forever. They fight their release, and they're still doing it.
Yeah, how can I trust you if you lie to me constantly? Dr. Bodden, what do you think the CIA, you've seen a lot of evidence from this case, what could they possibly want to hold from public view?
Well, embarrassing information. They didn't do their job right, presumably. The FBI didn't properly deal with Oswald, whom they knew was in Dallas, who had complained to the Dallas FBI agents there that he didn't want them to be interviewing his wife, and that it appeared that Hoover, the FBI, the CIA did things that would be embarrassing for them, not that would reveal anything that created a conspiracy with anybody. They released the route of Kennedy the day before, so that Oswald happened to see that he's driving by where he happened to be working, and that's why he brought his rifle there. So there was no conspiracy. It was just bad management by various agencies.
Sadly, that's usually the case. Joe Poser, you've seen some of the documents that have been recently released. What do they tell us? Anything interesting?
I mean, there's some, it's very hard to draw those conclusions right away. I'm always afraid of cherry picking information, because then there's got to be a document 10 behind that's going to contradict what you just saw. But it's interesting. It's sort of the size of this investigation. You get that very clearly in 1963 in terms of the FBI notices that are flying back and forth. And I think that one of the things we can find is exactly what Dr. Bodden was talking about before. What the CIA has always held back. Remember, this was an intelligence agency, Tucker, that lied to the Warren Commission when the Warren Commission was doing its own investigation on who killed Kennedy. They didn't want the commission to find out that they were in league with the mafia to kill a head of state, not Kennedy, but Castro. So that didn't come out for another 10 years. They've always been concerned about what became public from all of that anti-Castro work. I think we'll find some of that here, but maybe not in this release. According to the CIA, they are holding back. They want to redact about 1% of the 18,000 CIA documents still left, so about 180 documents. They would like to redact some of the names, but this law requires it to be every word on every document has to be public. That will be the fight for the next 6 months.
It's insane. I mean, the president should just overrule it. Thank you both very much. I appreciate it. Interesting.
Thank you, Tucker.
Thank you.
It's time for Final Exam. We've got 2 Fox News hosts enter the arena. You'll find out which of them has been paying more attention to the news in this chaotic week of news. That's next. Now for Final Exam, where we pit 2 major figures in the news business against one another to see if they've been paying attention at work. Our contestants this week: Shannon Bream, host of Fox News at Night, which debuts on Monday, this coming Monday at 11 p.m. Eastern. We're going to watch every night. And Brian Kilmeade, host of Fox and Friends, Fox News Radio from 9 to noon every day, and the author of a fantastic new book called Andrew Jackson and the Miracle of New Orleans. We're honored to have you both here.
I'm thrilled to be here, as well as to see Shannon. I heard she's working hard on a brand new show, but to see you in person and to see your studio, this thing goes on forever.
It's unbelievable.
So far back.
Cavernous.
It's like a movie studio. It's unbelievable.
Well, he's a movie star.
Right, I know.
So that feels appropriate.
It's more like a walk-in
that's what it
closet.
says on his office door. I love the way the introduction. See if they're paying attention at work. Is this what it got to?
We're going to find out right now. So here are the rules. Hands on buzzers. I'm going to ask the questions. The first one of you to buzz in gets to answer the question. You have to wait until I finish asking it, though. There's a penalty for early buzzing. Point. You get it wrong, you lose 8 points. First to 5 wins.
Quick question. If she gets it wrong, which could happen, can I come in second and get it right?
No, that's it. That's it. So the buzzer's kind of important. Yeah, it's important. Okay, you ready?
This is a lot of pressure.
Question 1. A popular viral video this week shows a man soaring high above the plains of southern Africa. But in lieu of a plane or a helicopter, what is his unusual method of flight? Brian Kilmeade, ladies and gentlemen.
Pass. No. Drone.
Drone. Let's go to the tape.
Look at this. This guy, Tom Morgan, strapping himself to a lawn chair. Gutsy move, attaching 100 helium balloons, flying over 15 miles across beautiful South Africa, reaching heights of 8,000 feet.
Okay, so let me check with the judges. Does a lawn chair with balloons on it qualify as a drone? No, it doesn't.
What kind of game is this?
It's a precursor to drone.
That's Fox and Friends First. What am I doing?
That's what I'm saying.
That's the show right before me.
You should be watching that.
Here's what I loved. I thought the video was going to be a video clip of Brian reading the story about the lawn chair.
That would be good. Let's see if you're awake. Okay, here's a chance at redemption. There was a wild scene on Capitol Hill this week as a heckler ranting about treason threw something at the President of the United States. What did he throw? Shannon Bream.
The Russian flag.
The Russian flag, says Shannon Bream. To the tape we go. That appeared to be, and by the way, what do I know about the Russian flag? Right. No, like I'm working for the Russians or anything. That was a Russian flag. Shannon Bream.
Boom.
So the score, just for those of you keeping track, 1 to -1.
Hey, can I just say this?
I like that.
You'll never know for sure, but I knew that too.
You got to work on the reflexes.
All right, it's fine.
Okay, so it's really a question of proving it, and you can do so in this case. Question 3. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio angered students this week when he pushed for changes to the New York City schools' cafeteria menu. Some schools will no longer be serving what? Brian Kilmeade.
Pizza.
Pizza. To the tape we go. Pizza.
These schools, like PS1, will be offering all vegetarian lunch and breakfast menus on Mondays. Even if you had a bacon, egg, and cheese this morning, you still should want to see more and more of our diets go to a plant-based approach.
Is there anyone dopier than Bill de Blasio? No, that wasn't the question. The question was...
I could have had that answer.
You would have
had that one. Because the answer is nobody. I mean, by the way, you know he sleeps till 11, right? He works out, right?
Yeah.
He works out, and then he leaves his door open, lays on his couch with the newspaper over his head, and lets people walk by.
Oh, yeah.
Because he stays up late at night and gets up and works out and then rests.
He's reading. You don't know that he's not reading.
Is that the Bream schedule?
What if he is nearsighted?
Right, absolutely.
I think there's a lot of reading going on. So now, not to rub it in, but it's 1 to -2. But you can still redeem yourself.
I didn't know you actually count back.
I do. I can count backwards.
We should put money on.
Question 4. Amazon, the company, just announced an interesting new service. For a fee, do what with your Amazon packages? Shannon Bream.
Take them inside your house.
I don't believe that. It's too weird. But we're going to see if you're right on our tape.
Tech titan Amazon is taking things a few steps farther, literally, delivering those packages not just to your doorstep, but inside your home. It's called farther, literally, delivering those packages not just to your doorstep, but inside your home. It's called Amazon Key.
How did you know that?
I mean, I've been watching news programming.
Would you let Amazon into your home?
Heck to the no.
I would let them in. Absolutely. I'd feed them. But I would say this. By the way, what about an A for effort? I didn't know the answer. I took a guess. You just don't play if you don't know the answer.
Right, that's
then
strategy.
You beat me.
I'm strategizing.
If you answer the final question correctly, you could get to -1. Okay?
Get to -1.
Yes, you could.
Can you make this triple or
no,
nothing?
You could get to -1.
No.
Okay. If you answer in Japanese, you can win.
Okay, I don't know that.
Well, we'll see.
Domo arigato, Mr. Roboto. That's all I need to know.
The 5th question. This week,
Wait. Could we get an update on the score first? I need to know what's at stake here.
It's one. This is a 2-point question. Our judges have just said this is a 2-point question.
Okay.
You can get to 0, Brian. So it's
Thank you.
-2
to 2. Okay.
Okay.
I could do as well as Lindsey Graham did in the primary.
Yes, you could. That's exactly right. You could win the Graham Prize. This week, Honolulu became the first major American city to make it illegal to do what while crossing the street?
Hint.
Does anyone watch TV here? The buzzer didn't go up.
Okay.
Brian Kilmeade.
Make it one more time with the question.
What did they make it illegal to do while crossing the street in Honolulu?
Oh, text.
Text.
That sounds reasonable.
I'm not sure if that's correct. We're going to go to the tape.
No more texting and walking across the street. Honolulu putting a law in effect today, stating that if you're caught doing this, you'll be paying a $35 fine.
Ooh.
You are back to par.
Back to 0.
You are back to 0.
I am still a 0.
You had sunk beneath the wave. Now you're floating even with them.
By the way, I'm not even getting my expenses satisfied because there's no proof that I was here. I came in with the same score I entered with. So who's going to satisfy?
But we're bearing the headline, which is Shannon Bream actually reads the news.
And
in
watches
her spare
the news.
time.
I do. I watch Tucker. I watch Fox and Friends. I listen to Kilmeade on the radio. I'm totally dialed in.
Shannon Brian, thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Man, was that a blowout. All right, well, I'll see you tomorrow night to talk about your new book. Brian Kilmeade will be back tomorrow.
Same outfit.
Same outfit. Yep. Tamer El-Nouri, that's his alias, by the way, spent years as an undercover FBI agent infiltrating radical Islamic groups in this country. It was dangerous work, so dangerous that when he spoke to us today, he wore prosthetics to hide his identity. Prosthetic nose, prosthetic chin, prosthetic forehead. It's amazing. Here's part of what he had to say. In your book, you describe how, and I don't think you're bragging, I think it's real, how completely fooled the extremists you lived among were by your cover. How did you convince them that you were one of them?
I study them. I mean, it's how do you make friends, Tucker, day to day, naturally. The proper evolution of a relationship.
Yes.
You just try to inject yourself, create the proper persona, we call it a legend, into that individual. But again, I get to cheat because I study their pattern of life, what they do, what they don't do, what they eat, what they don't like to eat, where they go, what they do. I jokingly say when they're not being jihadi, that human contact. Once I have that, it's really not that hard to craft my legend.
So if you need a prosthetic forehead to come on this show and tell your story about your book, I mean, your life has got to be very weird at this point. I mean, you've got to take a lot of precautions to keep from getting killed, and also your family. What's that like?
Yeah, well, that's a bit of a conundrum here, is you're right. Here I am talking to you, but it's a message that I believe very strongly for the people who don't have a voice, but also for the men and women of the FBI who combat terrorism every day to keep our country safe. I'm hoping that Americans know that there is Muslims and non-Muslims at the tip of the spear in the global war on terror, and this is how it's done, and I'm hoping that message gets out.
You can catch part 1 of our full interview tomorrow night, 8 p.m. Eastern at Always, and check out Al-Nuri's book, which is excellent. It's called American Radical: Inside the World of an Undercover FBI Agent. Really an amazing story. That's it for us tonight. Tune in every night at 8 to the show that is the sworn enemy of lying, pomposity, smugness, and especially groupthink, which is really hurting this country. DVR if you haven't already. Good night from Washington. Hannity takes over now from New York City. Hey, Sean.
All right, Tucker, thank you, and you're not going to want to miss it.